diaries. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
My Lords, in this mammoth omnibus bill, there's an uncomfortable shift in the balance of power away from citizens and towards the state and the police. It feels like a lockdown hangover. The suspension of civil liberties for a public health emergency was bad enough, if understandable. But now, using the language of safety and protecting citizens and fear, again, although fear of crime this time, I'm worried the government thinks the new normal should be less freedom and fewer rights. There are lots of examples of this throughout the bill, but for now I'll confine my remarks to Part 3, which I think should be removed in entirety from the bill. Why? Well, because, firstly, despite the reassurance from the Minister, which I know she means sincerely, having read the bill, I can't see how it isn't glaringly obvious that it will damage hard-fought for historic rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Other noble lords have explained that very well. But secondly, why is Part 3 necessary at all? Because there are actually plenty of laws on the statute books that would deal with the problems the government have identified. I realise that this debate comes hot on the heels of Extinction Rebellion's M25 rather egregious disruption of the lives of so many drivers, and there have been a series of utterly galling and self-indulgent actions of late, and it becomes easy to conclude, as many do, lock them up and throw away the key. And don't get me wrong, I find that these stunts are misanthropic and narcissistic, and I think it's a real problem that they're driven by the anti-democratic instinct that because the majority are allegedly being too slow at adopting net zero or hair-shirt eco-policies, that they must be coerced, bullied and annoyed into submission by these demonstrations. But I don't think the answer to that anti-democratic instinct is for the government to introduce anti-democratic legislation. The truth is, the statute books are bulging with laws that could be used to ensure that when protest tips over into bringing society to a halt, it can be dealt with. If statues are pulled down, buildings defaced and roads blocked, we already have laws against that. Criminal damage, obstructing highways, hindering emergency vehicles, that's all against the law. Cressida Dick even conceded on a review of the Extinction Rebellion protests in London that the powers of the 1986 Public Order Act were sufficient to deal with it. Surely the question for the Home Secretary is why aren't the police enforcing the existing laws? Why do they so often seem to stand by and watch when obvious law-breaking happens? Why do the police seem instead to be rather zealous when, for example, they're scouring social media for allegedly offensive tweets? They become very efficient at adding innocent citizens' names onto the utterly illiberal non-crime hate incident database, has already been mentioned today, and they're very energetic when they're parading their own social justice and diversity credentials on Instagram. But they seem somehow hesitant when they're policing some demonstrations. Now, I appreciate that that comes over as a crass caricature by me. Some people might not be surprised. But to note is the way it's widely discussed and perceived. Many people in the public believe that the police have become politicised, that they treat demonstrations differentially, some with kid gloves, some with real brute force. And yet here, in this bill, in Clause 55, we're asking the police to have even more discretionary powers to decide what protests should be clamped down on, what should be allowed, etc. And this can only exacerbate and put the police into an even more political pressure. And it's why so many frontline officers are themselves worried about the bill. The police, for example, will have to decide which protests may or risk causing too much noise or result in disruption, as we've heard. And I do think, as the noble Lord Dubs very wittily reminded us, that those who are not familiar with demonstrations should note that protests are by their very nature noisy. That's the point. They aren't sedate garden parties or occasions where you whisper. Noise is a crucial way to make your voice heard by the people in power, but also actually by your fellow citizens who you're trying to persuade to join you. And the larger the demo, the noisier. One of the noisiest demos that I inadvertently encountered was calling for a second referendum. I was harangued by many of the people on it. I can assure you I didn't agree with it, but it was certainly loud, and I defend their right to shout even about an anti-democratic call for a second referendum. I find it particularly distasteful that Clause 58 widens the geographic scope of curtailing protest around Westminster. Of course, parliamentarians need access to their place of work for democracy to function, but this clause has much wide-ranging provisions that it creates a de facto buffer zone around the corridors of power to protect the Westminster Village from encountering dissenters. This government regularly rails against student snowflakes retreating into safe spaces, and now it suggests turning the palaces of Westminster into a giant safe space and echo chamber. I think that would be a terrible mistake.